You can't even afford a house. My relatives laughed at the family gathering. I chuckled and dropped the bomb. I actually own the house you're all partying in. Everyone shut up instantly. Ethan adjusted his worn flannel shirt and stepped onto the pristine marble porch of the colonial mansion. The October breeze carried laughter and chatter from inside. His family's annual reunion was already in full swing. He paused, fingers tracing the brass door handle he'd polished himself just yesterday. Nobody knew, not yet. Through the tall windows, he could see his relatives sprawled across the leather furniture, their designer clothes a stark contrast to his thrift store jeans. Uncle Carl's booming voice dominated the conversation, while Brad gestured wildly with what looked like his third beverage. Jessica sat perched on the armrest, her perfectly manicured nails catching the chandelier light as she scrolled through her phone. They'd been gathering here for 3 years now, ever since old Mrs. Henderson had supposedly moved to Florida. The family had found this rental through some exclusive agency, prime location, fully furnished, absolutely perfect for their yearly show-off fest. What they didn't know was that Mrs. Henderson had been Ethan's neighbor, and when her son couldn't afford the property taxes, she'd sold it quietly to avoid the vultures. Ethan pushed open the heavy door, immediately hit by the familiar mixture of expensive perfume and his aunt's signature casserole. The conversation didn't pause. Why would it? He was just Ethan, the family disappointment who worked construction and drove a beat-up Toyota. There he is. Brad's voice cut through the air like a rusty knife. Thought you weren't going to show, cousin. Jessica looked up from her phone, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. Wow, Ethan actually made it. Did you take the bus here? Or did that truck of yours finally die? The familiar burn started in his chest, that old cocktail of shame and rage he'd been swallowing at these gatherings for years. But tonight felt different. Tonight he had something they didn't know about. Uncle Carl lumbered over, his considerable bulk wrapped in what had to be a $1,000 suit. Boy, you're looking thin. Claire's still not feeding you, right? He clapped Ethan on the shoulder hard enough to make him stumble. Maybe if you got yourself a real job instead of swinging hammers all day. The insults kept coming like a well-rehearsed performance. Ethan nodded and smiled, playing his assigned role as the family punching bag. He wandered through rooms he knew better than anyone, past the kitchen where he'd replaced the plumbing, by the staircase where he'd refinished every banister spindle by hand. This place is incredible, Jessica gushed to her cousin Amanda, who'd flown in from Seattle. Can you believe we get to stay here? I mean, whoever owns this must be loaded. Brad joined their conversation, gesturing at the oil paintings Ethan had carefully selected from estate auctions. Right? This is what real success looks like. Not like some people who are still renting apartments at 35. His eyes found Ethan across the room. The mention of his apartment sent a familiar spike of anxiety through Ethan's gut. What they didn't know was that he'd kept that tiny one-bedroom specifically for moments like this. Let them think what they wanted to think. Claire squeezed his arm as she appeared beside him. You okay? She whispered. Dinner was the usual battlefield disguised as family bonding. Ethan sat at the far end of the mahogany table he'd restored himself, listening to the familiar symphony of humble bragging and thinly veiled insults. Brad launched into his standard routine about his tech startup's latest funding round, throwing around numbers that were probably inflated by 50%. Jessica countered with stories about her marketing firm's celebrity clients, names dropping like confetti at a parade. And what about you, Ethan? Uncle Carl's voice carried that particular tone reserved for addressing children and disappointments. Still doing the construction thing? The way he said construction thing made it sound like Ethan spent his days playing with toy trucks. Several relatives chuckled into their beverage glasses. Yeah, still building things, Ethan replied quietly, cutting into the prime rib that had cost him $200 but would be worth every penny tonight. Well, at least someone has to do the manual labor, Jessica added with a patronizing smile. We can't all be entrepreneurs. The conversation shifted to real estate, as it always did when his family gathered. Property values, mortgage rates, investment opportunities. They spoke about houses like chess pieces, moved around for maximum profit and minimum heart. This rental market is insane, Amanda complained, swirling her beverage. Do you know what we're paying for this place? But it's worth it for the location. Austin's property values are through the roof. Brad nodded sagely. Smart money is in real estate right now. I'm looking at a second property myself. Investment potential is huge. Speaking of smart investments, Jessica turned toward Ethan with that predatory smile he remembered from childhood. Are you still in that tiny apartment downtown? What is it? Like 500 square feet? The table went quiet except for the soft clinking of silverware. Here it comes, Ethan thought. The annual ritual where they dissect his living situation like medical students examining a particularly sad specimen. It's small, he admitted, which was true. His apartment was exactly 450 square feet of strategic deception. Uncle Carl leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. You know, Ethan, at your age, most people are thinking about settling down properly, building equity, making something of themselves. The words hit like familiar punches. Ethan had heard variations of this speech every year since he'd turned 25. The subtext was always the same. He was failing at life while they were winning. The rental market's brutal right now, Brad added, false sympathy dripping from his voice. But hey, maybe someday you'll be able to afford something real. Maybe a nice starter home in the suburbs. Jessica laughed, that crystalline sound that had haunted his childhood. Can you imagine Ethan trying to get a mortgage with his credit and that job? Claire's hand found his under the table, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. She squeezed gently, a reminder that she knew the truth, that she'd been there for every late-night planning session and early morning renovation project. The irony was delicious. Here they sat, in his house, eating his food, drinking his carefully selected beverages, all while mocking his supposed inability to achieve exactly what surrounded them. Back in the living room, the conversation had somehow circled back to him. They were discussing his life like he wasn't sitting right there, voices carrying that particular volume people use when they want to be overheard. It's just sad, really, Jessica was saying to Amanda. He has so much potential, but he's just stuck, still living like he's in college. Brad nodded thoughtfully. I offered him a job at my company last year, entry level, but it would have been a start. He turned me down, said he preferred working with his hands. The job offer had been real, but Brad had conveniently forgotten to mention it was for $10 an hour less than what Ethan made on a slow week. Working with his hands had built him everything he owned, including the roof currently sheltering his ungrateful family. Uncle Carl's voice boomed across the room. The problem with Ethan is he's got no vision, no ambition, content to just get by, instead of really making something of himself. Ethan sipped his coffee, single origin beans he'd imported himself, and let the words wash over him. Soon, very soon, the dynamic would shift. The moment he'd been waiting for finally arrived when Jessica stood up, slightly unsteady from the evening's indulgences, and gestured grandly at their surroundings. I mean, look at this place, she declared, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who thinks they're being profound. This is what success looks like. Real success. Not scraping by, not barely making rent, but actually owning something beautiful. The others murmured agreement, their eyes scanning the artwork, the custom millwork, the carefully curated furnishings that had taken Ethan years to select and afford. Exactly, Brad chimed in, standing to join her impromptu speech. This is the American dream, right here. Property ownership, financial stability, the ability to actually afford the finer things in life. Uncle Carl raised his glass. To success, he announced, and to those smart enough to achieve it. The toast hung in the air like a challenge. Around the table, glasses lifted in solidarity. Everyone except Ethan, who sat quietly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. What's wrong, Ethan? Jessica noticed his hesitation. Not drinking to success? The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Ethan. This was it, the moment 3 years of careful planning had been building toward. He set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, the small clink echoing in the sudden quiet. You know what? He said, his voice steady and calm. You're absolutely right, Jessica. This place really is incredible. She preened at what she thought was agreement, not noticing the slight edge that had crept into his tone. The crown molding in the dining room took me 6 weeks to install properly, he continued conversationally. Had to special order it from a craftsman in North Carolina. Cost me $4,000, but it was worth it for the authentic period detail. The confusion started as small frowns, slight tilts of heads. Brad was the first to catch on, his glass freezing halfway to his lips. The kitchen renovation was the real challenge, Ethan went on, warming to his subject. Updating all the electrical and plumbing while maintaining the original aesthetic. I did most of the work myself, obviously. Saved me about $30,000 in contractor fees. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Jessica's mouth had fallen slightly open, her brain still processing what she was hearing. Uncle Carl's face was cycling through several shades of red. "What are you saying?" Amanda whispered, though they all knew exactly what he was saying. Ethan stood up slowly, his movement causing several relatives to unconsciously lean back in their chairs. He walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a small framed photograph, him and Claire on moving day, paint splattered and exhausted but grinning. "I'm saying welcome to my house," he said simply. "Thanks for coming to my annual family reunion. In my dining room, eating food I bought, sitting on furniture I selected." The explosion was immediate and chaotic. Brad shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor Ethan had refinished by hand. Jessica's beverage glass slipped from her fingers, red liquid spreading across the Persian rug like spilled blood. "That's impossible," Uncle Carl sputtered. "You can't afford, you don't have, your job." "My construction company," Ethan corrected gently. "The one I started 7 years ago. The one that's been quietly building half the custom homes in West Austin." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Brad's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence evaporating like steam. Jessica looked like someone had just explained that gravity worked backwards. But you drive that old truck," she stammered. "And your apartment is a workshop and office space downtown. Cheaper than renting commercial property, and it keeps people from asking too many questions." Ethan's smile was gentle but sharp. "Amazing how assumptions work, isn't it?" Uncle Carl's voice came out as a croak. "How long have you? When did you buy this place?" 3 years ago, right after Mrs. Henderson decided to move closer to her grandchildren in Tampa. She gave me first right of refusal because I'd been helping her with maintenance work." He gestured around the room. "You've been renting it from me this whole time." The mathematical implications were starting to dawn on them. 3 years of rental payments, premium rates for premium property, all flowing directly into the bank account of the man they'd been mocking for his supposed poverty. Amanda made a small choking sound. "The rental agency is my property management company, LLC, registered under Claire's maiden name." The room erupted into chaos. Brad started pacing like a caged animal, his hands running through his perfectly styled hair. Jessica had sunk back into her chair, staring at Ethan like he'd just revealed he could fly. "This is insane," Brad kept repeating. "This is absolutely insane. You let us. You made us." "I didn't make you do anything," Ethan said quietly. "I just never corrected your assumptions. Every insult, every condescending comment, every piece of advice about how I should live my life, that was all your choice." Uncle Carl's face had progressed from red to purple. "You humiliated us, made fools of us. Actually, I think you handled that part yourselves." The words came out sharper than Ethan had intended, years of suppressed anger finally finding their voice. "I just provided the venue." Claire appeared at his side, her presence grounding him. She'd been quiet all evening, playing her own role in their elaborate theater. Now she looked around the room with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. "The thing is," she added softly, "Ethan wanted to tell you years ago. He was excited about his success, wanted to share it with his family. But every time he tried to talk about his business, you'd shut him down or change the subject." The accusations settled over the room like dust after demolition. Nobody could deny it, because nobody could claim they hadn't enjoyed their perceived superiority over Ethan. It had been a family sport, making him the cautionary tale, The example of what happened when you lacked ambition. That's not. Jessica started, then stopped. Because it was true, and they all knew it. The worst part, Ethan continued, his voice gaining strength, wasn't the insults or the condescension. It was watching you teach your kids that success is about looking down on other people. That having money gives you the right to be cruel. Amanda's teenage son, who'd been scrolling through his phone in the corner, looked up with sudden interest. He'd been absorbing every casual cruelty, every dismissive comment, learning from the adults how to measure worth and distribute respect. "I built this," Ethan said, his gesture encompassing not just the house, but everything it represented. Every board, every nail, every careful decision. "I built it with my hands and my mind and my vision. The same hands you've been mocking, the same vision you've been questioning." The weight of wasted time settled over the room like a shroud. Years of family gatherings poisoned by unnecessary cruelty, relationships damaged by pride and prejudice. Ethan could see his relatives processing not just the revelation of his success, but the magnitude of their own behavior. Amanda was crying quietly now, probably thinking about all the conversations where she'd joined in the casual mockery. Uncle Carl looked like he'd aged a decade in the past hour, his bluster completely deflated. "So what happens now?" Brad asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan considered the question. He could throw them out, ban them from his property, cut them off completely. The power was entirely his now, and they all knew it. The same people who'd spent years making him feel small and powerless were now completely at his mercy. "Now," he said finally, "you have a choice. You can keep being the people you've been, in which case this is probably our last family gathering, or you can decide to be better." He stood up, Claire beside him, and looked around the room at faces he'd known his entire life. "I'm going to bed. You're welcome to stay the night. The bedrooms upstairs are ready, and breakfast will be available in the morning. But tomorrow, we start over. Or we don't start at all." As they walked toward the staircase Ethan had rebuilt from scratch, he could hear the murmur of conversation beginning behind them. Voices hushed and uncertain, probably trying to process everything that had just happened. Claire waited until they reached the privacy of their bedroom before speaking. "How do you feel?" Ethan sat on the edge of the bed he'd built himself, in the room he'd designed as their sanctuary. "Tired," he said honestly, "and sad, and maybe a little relieved." "Think they'll change?" He considered the question, while changing into the worn t-shirt and flannel pants that were his real uniform, not the careful costume he'd worn downstairs. "Some of them might. Uncle Carl's probably too set in his ways, but Jessica, maybe. Brad definitely has it in him to be better." Through their bedroom window, he could see the lights of Austin twinkling below. Somewhere out there were houses he'd built, families living in spaces he'd created with his hands and heart. That work would continue tomorrow, regardless of what happened with his family tonight. "Do you regret waiting so long?" Claire asked, settling beside him. "No," he said, surprising himself with the certainty. They needed to see who they really were first. The next morning, Ethan woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from his kitchen. Voices carried through the house, quieter than usual, more subdued, but present. They'd stayed. Downstairs, he found Jessica attempting to operate his professional-grade espresso machine, while Amanda set the table with his everyday dishes, not the fancy china she'd used for dinner parties. Uncle Carl sat in the breakfast nook, reading the newspaper and looking older but somehow more human than he had in years. Brad looked up as Ethan entered. "Morning," he said quietly. "Hope it's okay. We thought we'd make breakfast. Least we could do." The dynamic had shifted completely. No more casual commands or assumptions that Ethan would serve them. They were guests in his house now, and they knew it. "Coffee's almost ready," Jessica offered tentatively. "I think I figured out your machine." They ate together in relative peace, conversation careful but genuine. No one mentioned the previous night directly, but the change was obvious in small gestures. Brad asking about Ethan's current projects with real interest, Jessica complimenting the renovations without patronizing remarks, Uncle Carl actually listening when Ethan spoke. It wasn't perfect. Years of damage couldn't be healed over breakfast. But it was a start, and sometimes a start was enough. As his family prepared to leave, gathering their things and loading expensive cars in his driveway, Ethan stood in the doorway of his home. His house, his success, his truth, finally revealed.